welcome to Khetztutorials and welcome to the next video. So this is where we left off in the previous video, and you're just going to create a new file. So just come here, say new file, then let's call it variables because that is what we're going to talk about. So variables.py and press enter. Now the new file is created and it just directed us to the new file. So now let's start. What are variables? In mathematics, if you have an equation like x plus 3 equals 8, you know that you actually have to solve this and say 8 times 3 and you have 5. So x is a variable. It takes on the value 5 in this case, and it's a placeholder. So that is what variables are. Variables are placeholders. They hold a value and represent that value wherever they occur. And that applies in programming as well. And so let's talk about variables. So we have quite a few types in Python or in any other programming language, and I'm just going to go ahead and cover each of them. So the first type that I want to talk about is the numeric type, and the technical term for this kind of comment is a docstring, and we covered it in a previous video. So I'm just going to use it to indicate what we're talking about, what we're dealing with. Now you can either have this as a single line comment or a docstring, doesn't really matter. I just want to have it as a docstring. So let's talk about numerical variables. And as the name suggests, you can guess that this talks about numbers. So we are not only going to talk about variables that hold numbers, but some other variables or variable types as well. But let's start with numbers because they're quite familiar. I also made the math analogy so that you can link the two. So when we deal with numbers, you can have integers and floats are just basically decimals. So just go through each of these and just give examples. Then we'll get to some other things. So let's start. Let's say you wanted to have some storage system of your marks for the semester and for a specific module, specific subject. Then you'd store your mark for test 1, and you'd say the mark for test 1 maybe was 80. 80 is an integer, it doesn't have a decimal. But let's say for test 2 you got 88, so equals, okay, I just want to be consistent with my spacing, 88.8, and this is a float. So you can indicate this with comments and say, okay, this is an integer and this is a float. So variables describe what you are storing. So it's best to use a descriptive name. We were storing the marks for test 1, and that is why I said that, and we're storing the marks for test 2. Now there are rules that govern how you should start your variable names and how variables work. So if you were to start with 1, let's say you were to say 1 underscore test equals 80, you'd see that it immediately highlights this in red, which means this is an invalid naming convention. You're not allowed to start a variable name, any type of variable. You're not allowed to start it with a number. You can, however, start it with an underscore. So you're allowed to start variable names with an underscore or a letter. So those are the two things that you can use. And inside the variable itself, you can use either a number or an underscore, right? So those are the only types of characters that you're allowed to use. So only allowed to use, so we can make it a comment if you want, but I'm just going to mention it and say, to start the variable, you're only allowed to use an underscore or a letter. It can be uppercase or lowercase, but you have to be consistent so that your code looks good, right? The preference is usually lowercase letters, and if you have some more descriptive info, like in this case, then you separate the letters or you separate the words using an underscore. And so those are just a few points on variables, how you name them. So first point is your variable names have to be descriptive. Second is they have to follow a similar order so that there's some order in your code. And third is that you can only have letters, underscores, and numbers in the variable itself. So you can't have any other special characters like the tilde or anything else. You can't have that in between. So only letters, numbers, and underscores. And now we're discussing numerical variables. So these are numbers which occur in this form. Can be this number, which is just a whole number like that without a decimal part, or it can have a decimal part. And here's something interesting that you can do. You can actually confirm that each of these are as you expect by printing. So we covered the print function earlier on. And just like in mathematics, when you want to access the x, or when you want to use x at a later stage, let's say you found that your x was 5, as I initially indicated, then wherever you have your x, let's say you have x plus y equals 10. If you want to have a 10, you know that x is 5, so in the place of x, you're going to substitute 5. So the same applies when you're dealing with Python or when you're programming. So if I write test1 over here, the value 80 would actually be passed into print. And you know that print will take out or will print whatever you pass into it down here in the terminal. That is what we expect. So let's test this out. It's going to say print test underscore 1 and see what the output is. So we have effectively stored the value 80 in the variable. So this is the variable. The name is the variable, right? And if you look at this, it prints out 80. And if you change this to test 2, expect it to give it as 88.8. And there it is over there. So whenever or wherever you want to use any of these values, you can just put this, the name of the variable or the variable itself. And this will actually help you a lot because it would avoid having you type this over and over. So I'd imagine that you'd want to use these variables quite a few times in your code. So instead of writing 80 every time, you just write this because you know that this represents 80. So these are the numeric variables. And to check the type, you can just say type. There's something that you can do. Then put it in brackets. So now we're printing the type. So whatever's inside the print brackets is going to be printed. What are we printing right now? We're actually printing the type. So let's take the type of test1. Let's check what type it is. So if I run that, it says class int, and int just stands for integer, and that is what we expected, right? It's an integer. What about the second one? What type is it? So if I change that, it says class float. So these are numeric variables. They're numbers that you use in different scenarios. And depending on what your application will be, you'll either use a float or an integer. And let's move on to another type of variable. So let's talk about text. So you can also store text as variables. So let's talk about text. They're formerly called strings. So text or strings. And with these, you can have an empty string. So let's call it an empty underscore string. And it would look something like this. You have double quotation marks with nothing inside, or you can have single quotation marks. I just usually prefer double quotation marks because that's how I'm used to typing it. It doesn't really matter. You can choose for yourself. And what this is an empty string. As the name suggests, it's empty. There's nothing inside. So if you want to represent a blank in Python, this is how you do it. And everything else, it can be a long sentence, or it can be something simple like the first name of a person, and say first name Khetz and last underscore name equals tutorials. This is what you have, and that is the first name, that is the last name. So this is descriptive. It's enough for anyone who's reading your code to know, and therefore it's not necessary to actually include a comment. So if your variables are descriptive, and if the lines of code that you write are quite descriptive, then sometimes there isn't any need for some comments. Just wrote this top docstring up here, just so we can all be on the same page. We're talking about text right now. And this can be as long as you want it to be, right? It can be a whole sentence. Sentences are also text. They're also strings, and you can store that in a variable as well. So once again, just like we did with the previous variables, let's try to print each of these. This time, let's do it all at once, or one after the other. Python reads from the top to the bottom, so it will print out everything in the order that we give it. So going to print empty string, going to print first name, then we're also going to print last name. Let's see what we get in the output. Clear the terminal by writing clear, then press enter, then run the file, and this is what we get. So if you look at that, in the place of empty string, there's nothing. It's empty. It's an empty string, and that is due to that. Then the print will automatically skip a line and go to the next print statement, which is first name. What is the first name? It's Khetz. So what did it do? That's what it gave us over there. And if you look at tutorials, and that is what it gave us over there. So we just confirmed that all of these names or all of these variables store exactly what we assign to them. So this equals sign is an assignment. So you assign a value. But since this is the first time that we see this, it's called an initialization. So if you want to get technical with it, there's a difference between initialization and assignment, right? So if you define something for the first time, then that is called initialization. But if it has been defined and you change its value, then it's going to be called assignment. Here's an example. So this would be the initialization, and this will be an assignment. Let's assign a new value. Let's call this pi, if you want. So this guy is called pi, and let's see what it prints. So let's print this, and it prints pi. So Python reads code from the top to the bottom. Even though this name is the same as this one, we've now assigned a new value to first name, and that is the value that will be registered over there. So make sure that you don't have conflicting variable names. If this was intended, then that is fine. But if you just wanted each of these to appear, then you had to give them different variable names. Because once you assign or reassign a variable name to something which exists, it will be changed. And that is what happened over here. So it's not Khetz anymore, it's pi. That's just the difference between assignment and initialization. Okay, so once again, we're also going to check the type. So let's check the type. What type do we have? Just put the function type around the names of these. So just put type, then a bracket, then have whatever it is that you want to find the type for inside parentheses. So you'd see that there's this red thing over here that indicates that there aren't enough parentheses. So this one and that one are now registered for type. But what about print? Print also has to be closed. And once you close that, then that red thing goes away, which means you've now done the right thing. Clear the terminal and run this. All of them are class str, which is string. So these are strings, and this is how you store text in variables. And let's move on to the next type. The next type, we have Booleans. So let me erase this. Okay. We have Boolean variables. Now, Boolean variables are true or false statements. And here's a cool thing. If you haven't noticed, on switches, let's say you have a switch, at least in South Africa, I don't know in other countries, you usually have this. And this is a 1, and this is a 0. This is on, and this is off. Or you can say this is true, this is false. That's what Boolean variables are for. You're actually representing whether something's true or false, whether it's on or off. So in your code, you can have, let's say, for example, is the stove on? This is just an example which I thought of right now. Well, my stove is not on, so that is false. And you have to make sure that it's a capital F. And the same applies to true. You have to make sure that it's a capital. So are we writing some code? Yes, we are. So that is true, right? So this is what Booleans are. That's all there is to them. And they're quite useful when you're checking for stuff in your code or when you're coding along. Either false or true, true or false. These are the only two types that you have, or these are the only two values that you have. Once again, if you want to print each of these, then you're going to check is the stove on, and I'm going to print if we're writing code or not. Okay, and let's print that quickly. So false, true, which is the order that we have the print statements and which is exactly what we stored in there. Once again, we're going to check the type of these. Let's check the type. What type are these things? We're going to do the same for the other one. So let's see, clear the terminal, and both of these are bool, which stands for Boolean. So those are Boolean types. And so far, we've dealt with single variables. So as you can see, this is just a single value assigned to a single variable. But what if you want to have a collection of variables which might be related? This is when we now move on to lists. So let's talk about lists. A list. So when you think of a list in a language or anything, you imagine something that is comma separated. So you have one item, you have another item, and another item, and that is exactly the principle that is followed here. But there is a convention, or there's a few rules which you have to follow. Now let's say you have exam marks. Now at the moment, let's say you don't have your exam marks because you haven't written your exam. So that would be an empty list. So this here is an empty list. So a list, you represent a list with these rectangular brackets. And if it has something inside, let's talk about your semester marks, for example. So you have semester marks, and now you're going to assign, or you're going to initialize, like we did with variables that only had one value. Then you're going to introduce these brackets, these ones specifically, and then you're going to enter your marks. Let's say one of them got 77, one of your other modules you got this, and the other, and so on, right? Whatever number that you want, they can continue as far as you want them to continue, or as far as necessary. And this is how you'd fill in your list. So now your list doesn't just have one value, just like in the previous case. Remember, we had test 1, which had only one value. Now this has a bunch of values, and this single variable holds all of these marks in it. So if you say print semester marks, let's look at what happens when you do that. You're going to run that, and it prints everything. So now this single variable stores all of these things. And this is quite useful in some applications. And this is just an introduction to this stuff. I will have a more detailed video covering lists and everything which will follow from here. So don't worry too much about it. I'm just introducing the types of variables that you can have. And another interesting thing about lists is you don't have to store the same type. So you have text, you have numbers. You don't specifically have to only store numbers like you did up here. You can have numbers and strings in the same list. So let's say you knew a specific order. You wanted to have the first name, you wanted to have the last name, then you wanted to have the height. My height is 1.79 meters. And this is a valid list, and it actually works. If we replace the semester marks in here with my details and clear the terminal, I like clearing the terminal, forgive me. And look at that. It's a valid list, and it has everything that we stored in it. So it can have any type of variable. It can also have a Boolean. It can have whatever it is, as long as whatever you're storing makes sense. That is the point of storing information. That is the point of having variables. We're storing useful information, so make sure that your information actually makes sense if you decide to use this kind of stuff. And we're just going to use one in this case to test our type. So let's use the one that we currently have in the print statement. Let's check what type of variable is it. So if I go through that to this, then I'll run that, and it says class list. So we said that these are lists, and that's exactly what it says the type is. The type of this is a list, and we've confirmed that. So now let's move on to the next type. The next type, we have tuples. So I'm going to erase that. And let's talk about tuples. Now tuples are quite similar to list, and everything that I'm going to cover until the end of the video is quite similar to lists actually. So let's start with tuples. Now tuples are the same, and I'm going to use similar names. There's an empty tuple, and you're going to have semester marks. And from the get-go, you'd see that the only difference is that this one has normal parentheses, or like the circular ones which you're used to, and lists had these ones, right? So that is the only difference that there is in definition. And there are other technical differences that I'll cover in the specific video for tuples. So you can go ahead and check that out when it's out. And let's go ahead and fill everything else. So there are two ways that you can actually define this. So you can, I'm sure this one, let's start here. So you can actually omit parentheses and just start writing your tuple list. I actually said tuple list, shouldn't have said that, but write your tuple sequence, and this is what you have over here. Or you can go ahead and put the parentheses, which would be much better so that you can see what's actually going on. But once again, it's up to you. So you have options to actually choose from, and you can once again store different types as I showed you here. So the tuple at the top, this is the valid tuple. The one at the top stores all of these things, and you can also define it with parentheses, or you can leave them out if you want. This one at the bottom is defined with parentheses, and it has a string, and a float. So let's see what happens. As you can see, none of them are highlighted in red, and when I run this, I will not get an error. So now, in this case, I'm just going to print all of them, expect an empty tuple, I expect semester marks, and I expect my details to be printed out exactly as they are. So let's test that. That's the only way to find out. If you look at that, we have an empty tuple. We have this tuple that has marks, and we have the last tuple that has khetztutorials 1.79. So let's just use one to test the type. Once again, you can always check the type of your variables to verify and to be sure of it. So let's run that. And if you look at this, it says class tuple. So this is indeed a tuple. The one at the top, even though it's empty, it is a tuple. Let's move on to the next type of variable. And we're now talking about sets. So sets, just like in mathematics, let's say you wanted to find the numbers which wanted to find a domain, you wanted to find a range. You might be used to this notation. Let's say x is an element of something, right? And you write it in this form. So sets, also in Python, are written in this form where you have these curly braces. And let's say you wanted to store the subjects that you do at school. So subjects, and then you'd have your curly braces, and you say calculus, is that how you spell calculus? And you'd have psychology, or whatever it is that you have. I just chose random ones. You have philosophy, if you like philosophy. And now we're actually dealing with Python. Let's call this Python 101, if you like. And this is a set, and this is how you describe a set. And I'm sure you're now thinking, wait, hey, all of these things basically do the same thing. You just have different brackets, or you just have different braces, but they actually can store the same stuff. And don't worry, I'll cover each one of them in a separate video, covering the differences as well as the application of each of them. So for now, let's just talk about these different types, what they are and what they do. Let's say you have Anna, and something is true about Anna, and Anna is from Brussels. Okay, so these are just examples of how you define sets. And once again, to confirm that your sets have been initialized correctly, you can just print your sets to see what's actually contained in them. So say customer, and we're going to run this. Forgot to clear my terminal, but doesn't matter. We have the first set, philosophy, psychology, calculus, and Python 101. We have the second one, true, and Brussels. And an interesting thing to note is sets do not preserve the order. So the order here was Anne True Brussels, but it came out as True Anne Brussels. And that also applies to philosophy, psychology. That's actually swapped around, but we'll cover more of that in a dedicated video for sets. So now let's once again check the type and look at the type of this. What type are you? Subjects. So let's find out. So type subject, run that plus set. So this is a set. We are happy. So last type that I want to cover is this type, and it's a dictionary. So you know about dictionaries, and it's where you look up a bunch of stuff. And these are quite efficient when you want to look up stuff because it just makes sense. So let's say we have a student and we have curly braces once again, but here's where the difference is. With all the others, we just mentioned all of our values that we wanted to store in them for sets, for tuples, as well as lists. We just stored everything that we wanted to store, but we didn't mention what those things were. Now with dictionaries, you actually can. So you want to store a name, then you put this colon, and you'd say what the name is, and the name is khetztutorials. So that is what the name is. Then you put a comma for your next entry. What is the next entry? You have to put something which is descriptive that describes the next entry. That is the height. My height is 1.79. A comma. Then what course are we doing? So whatever number of values that you have. So these are called key value pairs. And they're called key value pairs because that's what they are. This is the key. This is the value. This is the key. This is the value. So if you want to access each one of these, it's quite easy because you just check what is the name, that is what I'm looking for, what is the height, what is the course, and it's quite more descriptive. So you have a key, you have a colon, then you have whatever value it takes. So if you look at this one, it doesn't have quotation marks because it's a numeric variable. So the variables on this side actually follow the form that they are. This is a float. It shouldn't have these quotation marks like everything else. So dictionaries, this is just an introduction to dictionaries as well. Just like how I introduced all of the other variable types. And we're just going to go ahead and print this. I know I've said this quite a few times, but I'll cover each of the lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries in their own videos, because there are quite a few things that I want to talk about, or there are quite a few things to them that I feel I have to mention. So just scroll down to those videos after this one if you're really comfortable with that, or just follow along with the order of the series. So now if I print student, what pops up? Name, height, course, and all of that. We now satisfy that that is what we stored. And if I want to check the type of this, what type is this student variable? So we're still talking about variables. This student is a variable. So now let's print the type. The type is dict, and that is for dictionaries. So we've now covered the main variables or the main variable types that are found in Python. We went all the way from numeric types. We talked about strings. We talked about lists, tuples, Boolean sets, and now the last one talked about dictionaries. I just want to leave you with a few notes that are quite important, and those would be that variable names are case sensitive, and this is what that means. So variable names are case sensitive, which means if you have student with an uppercase equals 20 and student with a lowercase equals 100, these two are different things. They're not the same thing. That is what case sensitivity means. So remember that previously, if you were to say student with the same case, now it would then change the value. So if you said student with value 20, then you said that exact name with the same case. So these are identical. Now student now holds 100 because Python reads from the top to the bottom. So student is now updated to 100. And when you print over there, we expect to get 100, right? That is what we expect to get. So let's run this. This is 100. But if you change this one to an uppercase, then student with a small letter has 20, but student with an upper letter has with an uppercase has 100, and these two will not be different. You have 20 and you have 100. Even if you swap these around, that is what I meant by case sensitivity. So you can't write this variable using an uppercase, or you can't change any other letter. Wherever you plan to use this specific variable, you have to write it exactly as it is. Wherever you choose to use this specific variable, you have to write it exactly as it is, with all of these uppercase and lowercase orders that you have over there, right? And please take note of the notes that I gave you. You can't start with a number when defining a variable. You can, however, start with an underscore, and your variable names should only have, so let's write this down actually. So I feel like I have to write this down. The first important point is case sensitivity. Sensitivity. And the second one is you can only start with underscore or letter, and your variables can only contain underscore, letters, or numbers only. And what other thing can I think of? So also you can convert from one variable type to another. I'll cover that in another video, but just keep that in mind, that you can convert from one to the other. And you can store sentences in strings. They can be whatever length that you want. And we've basically covered what I wanted to talk about. So this is an introduction to variables. It was quite long. I believe it was quite long, but at the same time, I do hope you got value out of the video and you got an idea of how you can actually store variables and text into words. And we're now going to talk about how to use these, and that will be the next video. We go into operations, how to actually operate with variables, how to manipulate variables, and how to do anything that you want to do with those variables. So this was an introduction to variables, the types of variables in Python. I hope you found value in this video. If you like the video, just give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. I will see you in the next video.